Sometimes ambition and greed can push a person to make decisions from which there is no return. In the bustling city of Newland, South Africa, the year 2015 saw the rise of Jacob Koster, a 36-year-old businessman with high ambitions. Jacob had recently graduated with a degree in business management and joined his family's well-established financial firm. The Koster family was one of the wealthiest and most influential in the city, and Jacob, as the only son, was poised to inherit the empire his father had built. Life in Newland was a whirlwind of business meetings, social gatherings, and luxurious events, but Jacob had a personal life that seemed just as successful. 2 years earlier, in 2013, he had married Laura Stevens, a well-known interior designer. They had met during their university days and quickly fallen in love. Laura, with her elegant beauty and warm personality, was admired by everyone. She had a thriving career and brought a sense of grace to Jacob's sometimes hectic life. Together, they seemed like the perfect power couple, young, wealthy, and deeply in love. The newlyweds had settled into a beautiful home on the outskirts of Newland, and their life appeared to be a fairy tale. Jacob's business career was taking off, Laura's design projects were gaining attention, and the future looked bright. However, beneath the surface, cracks were starting to form. Jacob's hunger for success began to eclipse his marriage. He spent more and more time at work, obsessing over his next big business deal, often leaving Laura feeling lonely and neglected. It was during this time of growing distance between him and Laura that Jacob met Eva Vaughn, a young and stunning employee who had recently started working at his family's firm. Eva was smart, driven, and captivating, everything that piqued Jacob's interest. At first, their interactions were professional, but as Jacob spent more late nights at the office, their relationship slowly shifted. Eva knew how to play to Jacob's ego, making him feel invincible. Before long, they were meeting in secret, their attractions spiraling into a full-blown affair. Meanwhile, Laura had no idea what was happening behind her back. To the world, she and Jacob were still the perfect couple. She continued to work hard on her projects and tried to connect with Jacob whenever he was home, but the connection between them was fading. Laura noticed Jacob becoming increasingly distant, but she chalked it up to the stresses of his business. Little did she know, her husband was leading a double life. As Jacob juggled his affair with Eva and his responsibilities as a husband, the pressure began to mount. Eva wasn't content with being the other woman forever, and Jacob's finances were starting to strain as he spent lavishly on both women. Something had to give, and soon Jacob would make a choice that would shatter his world and Laura's forever. As the months wore on, Jacob found himself increasingly entangled in the web he had spun. It was now early 2016, and his affair with Eva Vaughn had reached a point of no return. Eva was no longer satisfied with their secretive meetings in hotel rooms and after-hours rendezvous in his office. She wanted more time, more commitment, more of his life. While Jacob had thought he could manage both relationships, the demands were becoming overwhelming. Laura, on the other hand, was growing more suspicious. Jacob's late nights at work, his constant distraction, and his frequent business trips to neighboring cities felt off to her. She had always trusted him. But something about his behavior didn't sit right anymore. She confided in a close friend, sharing her concerns about how distant Jacob had become. The friend advised her to have an honest conversation with Jacob, but every time Laura tried, he brushed off her worries, blaming his workload. At work, Jacob's professional life was also starting to suffer. Running a company while juggling two demanding relationships was pushing him to his limits. Eva, who had initially been a secret distraction, was now pressing him for more. She wanted a future with him, not just stolen moments. She began asking questions about when he would leave Laura and what their life together would look like. Jacob, increasingly cornered, could see no clear way out. Divorcing Laura wasn't an option. His family, especially his father, would never forgive him for ruining the carefully crafted image of the perfect marriage. Laura was not only beloved by Jacob's parents, but she was also well respected within the family business circles. The Kosters had built their wealth and reputation over decades, and Jacob's father, Robert Koster, was a man of principles. The disgrace of a divorce would bring shame upon the entire family, and, more importantly to Jacob, would likely mean losing his place in the family empire. Meanwhile, Eva's expectations were becoming unreasonable. She had started dropping hints about needing financial help, about how hard it was to make ends meet with her modest salary at the firm. Jacob, already struggling to maintain his lifestyle, was spending more and more money on lavish gifts, expensive dinners and weekend getaways to keep Eva satisfied. His bank accounts were draining fast, and he began dipping into company funds to cover the costs. The tension in his life reached a breaking point in the spring of 2016. One evening, after yet another heated argument with Eva about his inability to leave Laura, Jacob sat in his office late at night, staring at the ceiling. He felt trapped. Eva's constant demands, Laura's growing suspicions, and his dwindling financial stability were all closing in on him. He knew he couldn't keep up this charade much longer. It was then that a dark thought crossed his mind. If Laura were no longer in the picture, everything would be simpler. No divorce, no family shame, no financial drain. He would be free to be with Eva and maintain his image as a successful, devoted man. But how could he make that happen? Divorce was out of the question, and Laura was too kind and trusting to suspect any foul play. That's when he thought of Jonas Gray. Jonas was an old acquaintance from university, a man with questionable morals and a reputation for handling shady dealings. They had drifted apart over the years, but Jacob knew Jonas still operated in the underworld, handling everything from problem-solving to loan sharking. If anyone could help Jacob with his predicament, it was Jonas. The next day, Jacob made the call. Sitting in a dimly lit bar on the outskirts of Newland, Jacob waited nervously for Jonas to arrive. His palms were sweaty and his heart raced as he thought about the conversation that was about to happen. When Jonas finally walked in, Jacob waved him over to the corner booth where he sat, away from prying eyes. Jonas, now in his early 30s, still had the same calculating look in his eyes that Jacob remembered. His hair was slicked back and he wore a leather jacket. His expression unreadable as he slid into the seat across from Jacob. "I didn't think I'd hear from you again, Jacob," Jonas said, leaning back and crossing his arms. "What's going on?" Jacob hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to broach the subject. He had rehearsed this conversation a dozen times in his head, but now that it was happening, the words felt heavy. "I need your help," Jacob finally said, his voice low. "I've got a problem, and I don't know who else to turn to." Jonas raised an eyebrow. His interest piqued. "What kind of problem?" Jacob swallowed hard, his hands trembling slightly. "It's my wife, Laura. I need her gone." Jonas didn't react right away. He simply stared at Jacob, his sharp eyes assessing the situation. "Gone? How?" he asked after a long pause. Jacob looked around the bar to make sure no one was listening, then leaned in closer. "Permanently." There was a long silence between them. Jonas didn't flinch. He didn't ask why or how. He simply leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "That's a big request, Jacob, and it's going to cost you." Jacob exhaled, relieved that Jonas wasn't rejecting the idea outright. "I know," he said. "I'll pay whatever it takes." Jonas nodded, his lips curling into a slight smirk. "All right, then. Leave the details to me. I'll handle it." As Jacob left the bar that night, he felt a mixture of relief and fear. He had set a plan in motion that couldn't be undone. Soon, Laura would be out of his life, and everything would be under control again. Or so he thought. In the weeks following his meeting with Jonas, Jacob's life became a blur of anxious anticipation. It was late spring 2016, and the weight of what he had set in motion pressed heavily on his chest. Every time he looked at Laura, guilt gnawed at him, but the prospect of freedom and Eva kept him focused. Jonas had been clear that the plan would take time. "These things don't happen overnight," he had said. Jacob had no choice but to be patient, as the plan was crafted and the pieces fell into place. Laura, blissfully unaware of the danger lurking around her, continued her routine, working on her design projects and trying to reconnect with Jacob, even as he remained emotionally distant. Eva, meanwhile, was growing more restless. She had no idea of the plan, and Jacob intended to keep it that way. He couldn't risk her finding out. Her temper was unpredictable, and she might lose control and jeopardize everything. So Jacob kept her at bay with promises of a future together and gifts to soothe her demands. Finally, one evening, just before the start of summer, Jacob received a call from Jonas. "It's time," Jonas said simply. Jacob's heart raced as he listened to Jonas explain the plan. The hit would happen in the early morning, when Laura would be leaving their house to attend a design conference out of town. Jonas had arranged for 2 of his men, professionals as he assured Jacob, to intercept her on the road. The plan was to make it look like a carjacking gone wrong, quick and clean, leaving no trace of Jacob's involvement. The night before the hit, Jacob could barely sleep. He lay in bed beside Laura, listening to the soft sound of her breathing, knowing that by this time tomorrow she would be gone forever. The morning of the hit arrived. It was still dark when Laura got up to prepare for her trip. Jacob had left early, telling her he had an urgent meeting to attend, but in reality he was nervously pacing in his office at work, waiting for the phone call that would confirm everything had gone according to plan. Laura left the house just before dawn. Pulling her suitcase behind her as she walked toward her car, the neighborhood was quiet, the streets empty at this early hour. She had no reason to suspect that danger was waiting for her just a few blocks away. As she turned onto the main road, a car pulled up alongside her, an unmarked vehicle with tinted windows. 2 men got out quickly, guns drawn, forcing Laura to stop. She barely had time to scream before they dragged her out of the driver's seat, shoving her into the back of their car. They sped off, leaving her car abandoned on the side of the road. Jacob sat at his desk, staring blankly at the paperwork in front of him. His phone was face up, the screen dark. He had told Jonas not to contact him directly once it was done, but that didn't stop him from nervously checking every few minutes. Hours passed. No news. By mid-morning, Jacob's nerves were frayed. He couldn't concentrate on anything, constantly replaying the plan in his mind. Just as he was about to call Jonas, there was a knock at his office door. It was Lucas Morrow, a longtime friend of Laura's family and a detective with the Newland Police Department. "Jacob," Lucas said, his expression serious. "I need to talk to you about Laura." Jacob's stomach dropped. He fought to keep his composure, his hands trembling slightly as he gestured for Lucas to sit down. "What's going on? Is she okay?" "We found her car abandoned on the side of the road this morning," Lucas explained. "She's missing." Jacob feigned shock, his heart pounding in his chest. "What do you mean missing? Where is she?" Lucas sighed, looking Jacob directly in the eyes. "We don't know yet. It looks like a possible carjacking. We're launching a full investigation, but I wanted to come to you first. I know this is a lot to take in." Jacob nodded, trying his best to appear devastated. "I can't believe this. Laura, she was on her way to a conference this morning. She left so early. Why would someone target her?" "We don't know yet, but we're doing everything we can to find her," Lucas reassured him. "We're bringing in a special team to assist with the search. I'll keep you updated." As Lucas left the office, Jacob felt a wave of nausea wash over him. He had thought he could handle this, that he was prepared, but seeing Lucas face to face had shaken him. The reality of what he had done, what was about to happen, was sinking in fast. The next 24 hours were a whirlwind. Laura's disappearance quickly became the top story in Newland, and news outlets ran non-stop coverage. Jacob, now thrust into the spotlight, played the role of the devastated husband, pleading for any information about his wife's whereabouts. Behind the scenes, however, Jacob was on edge. He hadn't heard from Jonas since the morning of the abduction, and the uncertainty was driving him mad. Every police update felt like a ticking time bomb, with Jacob constantly fearing that something had gone wrong. By the second day of the investigation, things started to unravel. Jonas, who had initially planned for a quick and clean execution, had run into complications. His men, after kidnapping Laura, had panicked. They hadn't expected the city-wide manhunt that followed, and they abandoned the original plan to make it look like a simple carjacking. Instead of disposing of Laura's body quietly, they held her hostage in a remote location, unsure of how to proceed with all eyes on the case. When Jacob found out about the change in plans through a coded message from Jonas, he was livid. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Laura was supposed to disappear quickly, with no loose ends. Now the police were closing in, and the longer Laura stayed alive, the greater the risk of her escape or exposure of the truth. Desperation set in. Jacob knew he had to take control, but every move he made now would be scrutinized. One misstep could unravel everything, and so the days dragged on. Each hour felt like an eternity as Jacob waited for the inevitable fallout, knowing that his carefully constructed plan was collapsing around him. But the worst was yet to come, as the investigation took a turn that would bring the truth closer to the surface than Jacob had ever feared, as the days stretched into a week. The pressure on Jacob Coster became unbearable. The news of Laura's disappearance had gone from being a local tragedy to a national headline, with every media outlet in South Africa covering the case. Search teams scoured the surrounding areas, and volunteers lined the streets, distributing flyers with Laura's picture. Jacob, now playing the role of the grieving husband, was constantly in the public eye, making appearances on television, pleading for her safe return. But behind closed doors, the reality was much different. Laura was still alive, held captive by Jonas's men, and the situation was spiraling out of control. Jacob had envisioned a swift, decisive act, one that would free him from his marriage without raising too many questions. But now, every passing day increased the risk that the truth would come out. In the first few days, Jonas had assured Jacob that everything was under control. "It's just a delay," he said over the phone in one of their carefully planned, discreet conversations. But Jacob knew better. The mounting tension in Jonas's voice betrayed his words. The heat from the police investigation was closing in on them, and there was only so long the men could keep Laura hidden before someone slipped up. On the 7th day of Laura's disappearance, Detective Lucas Morrow began to connect the dots. Lucas, having known Laura for years and being close to her family, was personally invested in the case. Something about Jacob's behavior didn't sit right with him. As experienced as he was, Lucas had seen his fair share of grieving spouses, and Jacob's reaction seemed off. His public pleas felt rehearsed, his emotions shallow, and his sudden disappearance from the spotlight after each media appearance raised red flags. That same day, Lucas received a tip from one of his informants. Someone had spotted a suspicious vehicle, one matching the description of the car used in the abduction near a remote warehouse on the outskirts of the city. It was a long shot, but it was the first solid lead they had. Lucas, along with a small team, headed to the location. When they arrived, they found the warehouse abandoned, but inside, traces of recent activity were everywhere. Old food wrappers, cigarette butts, and ropes left hastily behind. There were no signs of Laura, but Lucas knew in his gut they were close. The breakthrough came the next morning. An ATM withdrawal from Laura's account had been flagged by the bank. The surveillance footage showed two men, nervous and fidgety, attempting to withdraw cash using her card. The footage was grainy, but it was enough to identify one of the men, Carl Venter, a known associate of Jonas Gray. Lucas wasted no time. Within hours, Carl was picked up by the police, and under intense interrogation, it didn't take long for him to break. Fearful of being charged with kidnapping and possibly murder, Carl confessed everything. He told the detectives about the plan to kidnap Laura, how it was supposed to look like a car, carjacking, and how things had gone wrong when the media attention became too intense. Most damning of all, Carl revealed that the entire plan had been orchestrated by none other than Jacob Coster. The news hit Jacob like a sledgehammer. He had been in his office, frantically trying to contact Jonas when Lucas arrived with a team of officers. Jacob barely had time to react before they stormed in, slapping handcuffs on his wrists. "Jacob Coster, you're under arrest for conspiracy to kidnap and murder Laura Coster," Lucas said coldly as he read Jacob his rights. Jacob's mind raced. He had been so careful, so calculated. How had it all fallen apart? As he was led out of the office in front of his stunned employees, the reality of his situation began to sink in. His carefully constructed life was crumbling, and there was no way out at the police station. Jacob was placed in an interrogation room, his hands still cuffed in front of him. He could hear the low murmur of voices outside the door as the detectives prepared to question him. His heart pounded in his chest, and he felt like he couldn't breathe. Moments later, Lucas entered the room, followed by another detective, Sergeant Nina LaRue. They sat across from Jacob, their expressions unreadable. "Jacob," Lucas began, leaning forward. "We know everything. Carl Venter has already confessed. It's over." Jacob's face was pale. His mouth felt dry. "I didn't. I never wanted to," he stammered. "Save it," Sergeant LaRue interrupted. We know you hired Jonas Gray to arrange the kidnapping and murder of your wife. We have phone records, ATM footage, and a confession. There's no point in lying." Jacob's mind was spinning. He knew there was no escaping the charges now. His last shred of hope was gone. Lucas watched him closely, waiting for a response. "Why, Jacob? Why would you do this to Laura? She loved you. You had everything. Was it the money? The other woman?" Jacob's shoulders slumped. The weight of his decisions was finally crashing down on him. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," he muttered. "I didn't know what else to do. I was drowning between Laura, Eva, the business. I couldn't keep it up." "So you thought killing your wife was the answer?" Lucas said, his voice filled with disgust. "You could have walked away, Jacob. You could have divorced her. But you chose this." Jacob remained silent, his eyes fixed on the table in front of him. There was nothing more to say. The truth was out, and there was no undoing it. Meanwhile, the police quickly moved to arrest Jonas Gray and the remaining accomplices. Jonas, unlike Carl, was tougher to crack, but with Jacob's confession and Carl's testimony, the case against him was airtight. Within days, the entire group had been apprehended and Laura's location was revealed. She was found alive, though shaken, in an abandoned farmhouse just outside Newland. After a week in captivity, she had feared the worst, but her ordeal was finally over. The news of Laura's rescue was met with a wave of relief across the city. She was immediately taken to the hospital, where she was reunited with her family. Her physical injuries were minor, but the psychological trauma would take far longer to heal. Laura's only comfort was knowing that Jacob, the man she had trusted with her life, would never be able to hurt her again. As Jacob awaited his trial in a cold, damp prison cell, he replayed the events of the past few months in his mind. His ambition, his greed, his desire for control. They had driven him to commit an unspeakable act. Now, stripped of everything he once held dear, Jacob faced the grim reality of his future, a lifetime behind bars, haunted by the memory of the woman he had tried to destroy. The courtroom was packed, the tension palpable as the trial of Jacob Coster began. It was early autumn 2016, and for weeks the case had dominated national headlines. Reporters and spectators alike crowded into the gallery, eager to witness the final act of a drama that had shocked South Africa. Jacob sat at the defense table. His face drawn and pale, his once immaculate appearance had faded. His tailored suits replaced by the somber, muted clothes of a man on trial for his life. Beside him, his attorney, Peter Rathbone, a seasoned defense lawyer known for handling high-profile cases, whispered last-minute instructions. But Jacob barely heard him. His mind was elsewhere, consumed by the magnitude of what was about to unfold. Across the room sat Laura, flanked by her parents and a few close friends. Though she appeared composed, the toll of the last few months was evident in her eyes. She had survived the ordeal of her kidnapping, but her life would never be the same. Her trust, her love for Jacob, had been shattered. Now she was here not just as a witness, but as a symbol of his betrayal. The prosecutor, Renee Muller, stood tall, her reputation as a fierce and determined lawyer preceding her. She was here to ensure Jacob paid for what he had done. The charges were clear: conspiracy to commit murder, kidnapping, and attempted murder. The evidence against Jacob was overwhelming, and Muller was prepared to lay it all bare before the jury. The trial began with the prosecution laying out the timeline of events, meticulously reconstructing Jacob's downfall. Muller called her first witness, Lucas Morrow, the detective who had led the investigation. Lucas's testimony was methodical and thorough, detailing the steps that had led the police to uncover Jacob's involvement. "We began to suspect Mr. Coster early in the investigation," Lucas said as he addressed the jury. "His behavior was inconsistent with that of a grieving spouse, and we found numerous inconsistencies in his statements." Muller then presented the damning evidence: the phone records between Jacob and Jonas Gray, the ATM footage showing Carl Venter attempting to withdraw money from Laura's account, and finally, the confession that Carl had given under interrogation. When Jonas Gray took the stand, his cold demeanor sent chills through the courtroom. His testimony painted Jacob as the mastermind, the one who had initiated the plot to murder his wife. Jacob came to me desperate, Jonas said, his voice calm but chilling. He wanted Laura gone, and he didn't care how it was done. He just wanted it to look clean, like an accident or a robbery gone wrong. Laura flinched at the words, her hands trembling in her lap. Jacob avoided her gaze, staring straight ahead as Jonas laid out the details of their meetings, how Jacob had paid him a large sum of money to arrange the kidnapping and murder. When it was time for Laura to testify, the courtroom fell silent. She took a deep breath, steadying herself as she approached the witness stand. Laura had practiced what she would say 1,000 times, but now, facing the man who had tried to end her life, her emotions threatened to overwhelm her. Laura's voice wavered at first, but as she recounted the events leading up to her abduction, her strength returned. She described how she had noticed Jacob growing distant in the months before, how she had tried to salvage their marriage, only to be met with indifference. "I love Jacob," Laura said, her voice breaking slightly. "I trusted him with everything, and I never imagined he was capable of something like this." Her testimony was powerful, filled with the pain and betrayal she had experienced. As she spoke, tears welled in her eyes and many in the gallery shifted uncomfortably, moved by the raw emotion in her words. Jacob kept his head down. He couldn't bear to look at her. In his defense, Peter Rathbone tried to argue that Jacob had never intended for things to go this far. He portrayed his client as a man pushed to the brink by financial pressure and emotional turmoil. Rathbone argued that Jacob had been manipulated by Jonas Gray, who had taken advantage of Jacob's vulnerability and twisted his desperation into something far darker. But the jury wasn't buying it. The evidence was too strong and the prosecution's case too airtight. As Mueller delivered her closing argument, she didn't hold back. Jacob Koster wasn't a victim of circumstance, she said, her voice sharp and clear. He was a man who made a cold, calculated decision to end his wife's life for his own selfish gain. He hired criminals to kidnap and murder her, because in his mind, that was easier than facing the consequences of his actions. Jacob had choices, and he chose violence. He chose betrayal, and for that, he must be held accountable. The jury deliberated for less than a day. When they returned, the room was thick with tension. Jacob sat rigid, his fingers gripping the edge of the defense table as the foreman stood to deliver the verdict. On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of kidnapping, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of attempted murder, we find the defendant guilty. Jacob's world collapsed around him. The air seemed to leave the room as the weight of the verdict settled in. His attorney placed a hand on his shoulder, but Jacob barely registered the gesture. All he could hear was the word guilty echoing in his head over and over again. Judge Annalise Brink, a stern and no-nonsense figure, looked down at Jacob with a steely gaze as she prepared to deliver the sentence. "Jacob Koster, your actions were cruel, calculated, and deeply disturbing. You betrayed the trust of your wife, your family, and society. For the crimes of conspiracy to commit murder, kidnapping, and attempted murder, I sentence you to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole." A collective breath was exhaled in the courtroom. Laura's family clutched her hands, tears of relief streaming down their faces. The long nightmare was finally over. As Jacob was led away in handcuffs, he looked back one last time at Laura. Their eyes met briefly. She was no longer the woman who had once loved him, and he was no longer the man she had once known. The connection between them, once full of love and hope, had been destroyed, burned to ashes by his own hand in the days following the trial. Laura began the slow process of rebuilding her life. She returned to her work, surrounded by the support of her family and friends. The scars of what had happened would never fully fade, but Laura was determined to move forward. Jacob, meanwhile, languished in prison, his name synonymous with betrayal and greed. He had once believed he could have everything, a perfect life, a beautiful wife, and the freedom to follow his darkest desires. But in the end, all he had left was the cold, unrelenting reality of his prison cell, where every day would remind him of the life he had thrown away. Months passed after the trial, but the echoes of Jacob Koster's betrayal lingered long in the minds of those who knew him. The story of his fall from grace, once a rising star in the business world, had left a permanent scar on the city of Newland. His actions had not only destroyed his life, but also ripped apart the lives of those closest to him. For Laura, however, the hardest part was just beginning. learning to live again, free from the shadows of her husband's crimes. Laura, now well into 2017, had returned to her design business. Her clients, old and new, were supportive, some even offering their homes for her to stay in if she needed space. But Laura was determined to regain control of her life. She had bought a small apartment downtown, away from the memories of the house she had shared with Jacob, and slowly began to rebuild. The pain of what had happened was still fresh, but Laura's resolve was stronger than ever. She immersed herself in work, filling her days with projects and clients. There were still nights where the memories of her kidnapping would haunt her, waking up in the darkness, surrounded by strangers who intended to end her life. But as the weeks turned into months, the nightmares became less frequent. Therapy sessions helped, and Laura's friends and family remained her lifeline. One day, as Laura sat in her new office, surrounded by sketches and fabric samples, she received an unexpected visitor. Lucas Morrow, the detective who had worked tirelessly to bring Jacob to justice, walked through her door. His presence was both a comfort and a reminder of all she had endured. "Lucas," Laura greeted, smiling faintly. "I wasn't expecting you." Lucas, always calm and measured, took a seat across from her desk. "I just wanted to check in on you. It's been a while since the trial, and I know things haven't been easy." Laura nodded, her eyes drifting to the large window overlooking the city. "It's strange, really. Some days I feel like I'm finally moving forward. But then I'll see something, like a place Jacob and I used to go, or I'll hear a song. And it all comes rushing back." Lucas leaned forward slightly, his gaze steady. "It's normal, Laura. What you went through was unimaginable, but you survived, and you're here now, living your life. That's what matters." Laura smiled softly, grateful for his words. Lucas had been one of her greatest supports throughout the ordeal, and though their professional relationship had ended with the trial, he had continued to check in on her, like a quiet guardian. "There's something else," Lucas said, his tone shifting. "We've received news about Jacob." Laura's heart skipped a beat. Though Jacob had been sentenced to life in prison, she had done everything in her power to distance herself from any news about him. The name alone stirred up a cocktail of emotions she wasn't ready to face. Lucas saw the tension in her expression and quickly added, "He's still incarcerated, don't worry. But there's been some trouble inside." Laura's brows furrowed. "What kind of trouble?" Lucas sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Prison is not kind to men like Jacob. He's been involved in some altercations, targeted by other inmates. His status as a wealthy, high-profile convict hasn't exactly won him any allies. There were a few serious incidents recently, one where he was attacked in the yard. He's recovering, but he's not the same." Laura felt a strange sense of detachment. The man who had once been her husband, the man she had loved so deeply, was now a distant figure, broken by his own choices. She wasn't sure what to feel. Pity. Satisfaction. Indifference. "I don't know what you want me to say, Lucas," she finally replied, her voice calm. "Jacob made his choices, and now he's facing the consequences." Lucas nodded. "I just thought you should know. It's not easy seeing someone go through that, no matter what they've done. But you're right. He chose this." Meanwhile, inside the cold walls of the Durban Correctional Facility, Jacob Coster lived a life far removed from the luxury and power he once knew. The arrogance and pride that had defined him were long gone, beaten out of him by both the system and the harsh realities of prison life. His wealth and status had marked him as a target from the moment he entered, and he had quickly learned that survival in prison was a game of submission. Jacob had tried to keep his head down, but his notoriety had made him infamous among the inmates. He was the rich man who had tried to murder his wife, a crime that disgusted even the most hardened criminals. And so Jacob found himself attacked, isolated and broken, serving a life sentence in every sense of the word. The worst part, though, was not the physical pain or the brutal environment. It was the solitude, the endless hours in his cell. Alone with his thoughts, haunted by the faces of Laura and the people he had hurt, every night he would lie on his thin mattress, staring at the ceiling, unable to escape the crushing weight of his guilt. He had once believed he could control everything, his life, his business, even other people. But now, stripped of all power, he was left with nothing but regret. Back in Newland, Laura's life continued to slowly heal. With each passing day, she regained more of herself, carving out a future that no longer included the shadow of Jacob. She began teaching design courses at a local college, sharing her passion and expertise with the next generation of students. For the first time in what felt like forever, Laura found joy in her work again. In late 2017, she was even offered a prestigious design contract to revamp the interior of a major hotel in Cape Town. It was a project she might once have taken on with Jacob's support, but now she felt empowered to do it on her own. She accepted the offer, seeing it as a new chapter in her life, one where she was in control of her destiny, free from the manipulations and betrayals of the past. As the year came to a close, Laura found herself reflecting on how far she had come. She had survived the worst betrayal imaginable, and yet here she was, stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever. The scars would always remain, but they no longer defined her. For Jacob, life in prison was a far different story. His name had been forgotten by the world outside. He had become just another inmate, another lost soul in the system. His future, once filled with promise, had been reduced to the cold, hard reality of a lifetime behind bars. The tale of Jacob and Laura Coster was over, a cautionary story of ambition, betrayal, and the high cost of greed. In the end, Laura had emerged not only as the survivor of Jacob's plot, but as a symbol of resilience, proving that even in the face of the deepest pain, there is always the possibility of redemption and hope. Thanks for watching. Subscribe and like this video for more true crime video. Don't forget to leave your thoughts and theories in the comments section below. Take care and see you in the next video.